There is a lie you have been quietly swallowing since you were a child. It is the comfortable delusion that the universe inevitably rewards the righteous. You know the exact feeling of this trap. You bite your tongue in the boardroom while a lesser, louder man takes credit for your months of silent labor. You take the high road in the relationship argument, swallowing your pride and your perfectly valid anger, convinced that this restraint makes you the bigger man. You suffer the quiet disrespect of your peers or your family in absolute silence, trusting that karma or time or some invisible moral judge will eventually balance the scales in your favor. But the scales never balance. They just keep tipping until you are empty. You haven't been practicing virtue. You have been practicing how to be perfect prey. We live in an era that worships the aesthetic of harmlessness, and it has trapped millions of intelligent men in a cycle of quiet desperation. You have been sold a modern, watered-down version of Stoicism that functions as nothing more than a pacifier for the working class. The self-help aisle is filled with authors telling you to just control what you can control, to accept your lot in life, to journal about your frustrations, and to endure the incompetence of your superiors with a stoic smile. This is not philosophy. It is operant conditioning for submission. It is a psychological sedative designed to make you an excellent, compliant victim. You are told that by retreating into your mind and accepting the world's abuse, you're acting like a philosopher king. But out here, in the harsh reality of corporate hierarchies, modern dating, and social dominance, virtue without teeth is just an invitation to the wolves. On the other end of the spectrum, you see the predators, the Machiavellians, the narcissists, the men who glide through polite society, bending everyone to their will. They lie, they triangulate, they flatter, and they conquer. Watching them succeed while you stagnate breeds a very specific, quiet resentment. It makes you wonder if you should abandon your morals entirely and become the villain. But you hesitate, and rightly so. Because pure Machiavellianism, divorced from inner discipline, is a fire that eventually burns the arsonist. The amateur who tries to be ruthless without the proper psychological architecture becomes sloppy. He becomes visibly paranoid. He burns critical bridges, and he destroys his own reputation because he lacks the internal coldness to wield the dagger without slicing open his own hand. This is the agonizing purgatory where most men spend their lives. You oscillate between these two extremes. You try to be good, and you get exploited by those who view your kindness as weakness. Then, sick of being used, you try to be assertive or ruthless, but the guilt consumes you, the anxiety spikes, and you retreat back into your passive shell. You are stuck playing a rigged game because you falsely believe you have to choose between keeping your soul and keeping your territory. You believe that to be a good man, you must be a harmless man. But harmlessness is not morality. It is merely a lack of capacity. If you cannot do harm, your decision to be peaceful is not a moral choice. It is just a biological default. You are watching men with half your intelligence and a fraction of your work ethic bypass you because they understand the mechanics of power while you are still memorizing the rules of fair play. They do not care about being the bigger man. They care about being the man who dictates the outcome. It is time to stop comforting yourself with the lie that your passivity is noble. The greatest conquerors, the most untouchable CEOs, and the most formidable patriarchs in history never chose between enduring the world and manipulating the world. They mastered both. To survive the modern hierarchy, you must understand that these are not opposing philosophies. They are two halves of the most dangerous psychological operating system ever designed. To install this dual operating system, we must first dismantle the catastrophic ways most men attempt to wield power. You have likely seen the amateur at work. He reads a summary of the 48 laws of power online and decides he is going to become a master manipulator. He adopts a forced, icy demeanor in the office. He starts playing obvious, petty games with his partner to incite jealousy. He burns bridges, alienates his colleagues, and earns a reputation not as a formidable mastermind, but simply as a toxic liability. He's eventually fired or abandoned, sitting in isolation while wondering why his newfound ruthlessness failed. His error was fatal, but common. He attempted to use Machiavellian tactics while remaining entirely governed by his own fragile ego, insecurities, and need for validation. He swung a sword he was not strong enough to lift. Now look at the actual apex player in that same environment. Look at the executive who survives every corporate restructuring, or the man who commands absolute respect in his social circle without ever raising his voice. He does not act like a movie villain. He smiles warmly. He remembers your daughter's name. He buys coffee for his assistants. Yet, when a rival attempts to undermine him, that rival is quietly and surgically removed from the company 3 weeks later, without a single fingerprint linking back to the smiling executive. How does this man sleep at night after executing a career-ending move? He sleeps perfectly. He sleeps like a child because he possesses the architecture of the Velvet Dagger. He has mastered the profound separation of internal regulation and external execution. This brings us to a truth that will likely sting before it clarifies. You tell yourself that you are the victim of bad luck, toxic bosses, or manipulative partners. You are not. Here is the cold reality you must swallow. You are the victim of the signals you broadcast and the incentives you create. You project a high tolerance for disrespect, and so the world naturally disrespects you. You reward bad behavior with your continued patience and then act shocked when the bad behavior escalates. You call this being a good person, but let us strip that comforting delusion away right now. You are not losing because you are moral. You are losing because your morality is actually just an inability to strike back. You use the label of goodness to mask your fear of confrontation and your lack of leverage. True power requires a violent severing of the link between your emotions and your actions. This is where the synthesis comes alive. Stoicism is not your strategy for dealing with the world. It is your strategy for dealing with yourself. It is the lead-lined vault where you lock away your anger, your fear of rejection, and your desperate need to be liked. You use stoic discipline to slow your pulse when you are insulted. You use it to scrub the emotion, the spite, and the sadism out of your decision-making. You must not feel hatred for the colleague trying to ruin you, because hatred makes you sloppy. You simply view them as a biological obstacle, a math problem that requires solving. Machiavellianism, then, becomes the pure, unburdened software you run to solve that problem. Because your internal fortress is secure, you do not need to posture, shout, or threaten. You can afford to be patient. You can afford to be flawlessly polite while you gather leverage, study their weaknesses, and lay the traps. When you finally spring the trap, it is not an act of emotional vengeance. It is an act of clinical necessity. You are a stoic on the inside, untouchable and serene, and a Machiavellian on the outside, fluid and lethal. Once you lock the fortress of your mind, the next step is learning how to weaponize the terrain outside of it. To weaponize the terrain outside of your internal fortress, you must first master the primary currency of human interaction, which is information. Think back to your last high-stakes confrontation. Perhaps it was a critical salary negotiation, a dispute with a cunning business partner, or a conflict in a relationship where you knew you were entirely in the right. How did you behave? If you are like most men trying to be virtuous and authentic, you walked into that room and you immediately started talking. You laid out your perfectly logical arguments. You explained why you were hurt, why their actions were unfair, and what you expected to change. You spoke quickly to fill the dead air, your voice rising in pitch to emphasize your earnestness. You leaned forward, believing that if they could just see your pristine logic, they would naturally concede. And across the table, your opponent sat perfectly still. They gave you nothing but a slow nod and unbroken eye contact. In that agonizing silence, you grew intensely uncomfortable, and so you kept talking, eventually negotiating against yourself and lowering your demands before they even had to draw their sword. You did not lose that interaction because your argument was flawed. You lost because you hemorrhaged your emotional data. Most people walk through the world desperate to be validated, treating their internal state as something that must be constantly broadcast to the public. They get angry to prove they are serious. They over-explain to prove they are honest. They sulk to show they are wounded. They are open books in a room full of illiterates and thieves. Every time you explain yourself unprompted, every time you let a flash of frustration cross your face or your tone betray your anxiety, you are handing your opponent the exact psychological coordinates required to destroy you. A manipulator does not need to overpower you. They simply wait for you to map out your own pressure points. This is where the amateur fails. He believes that dominance is about being the loudest, most aggressive voice in the room. But true power is entirely asymmetric. The man who speaks the most pays the most. The man who speaks the least controls the board. Here is how the synthesis applies this law of asymmetry. Stoicism demands absolute internal silence. Machiavellianism demands external asymmetry. When you enter a conflict, your stoic discipline must act as an anchor, allowing you to tolerate the physical, visceral discomfort of an unresolved pause. Silence is heavy. It induces a primal anxiety. The Stoic embraces that gravity without feeling the frantic urge to alleviate it. Simultaneously, your Machiavellian operating system recognizes that this silence is not just a shield. It is a tactical vacuum. Human beings naturally abhor a vacuum. If you simply look at someone with dead, calm eyes after they make an aggressive demand, their own anxiety will force them to start filling the void. They will begin to justify themselves. They will nervously backpedal. They will reveal their true motives simply because they cannot stand the psychological pressure of your unblinking observation. You must train yourself to become a blank mirror. When you are furious, your face must convey nothing but mild boredom. When you are ecstatic, your voice must remain entirely flat and measured. You deny the world the satisfaction of knowing how its actions affect you. This is not repression. Repression is lying to yourself about what you feel, which leads to weakness. This is tactical containment. You feel the emotion deeply within the vault of your mind, but you refuse to let it leak into your posture, your breathing, or your prose. When they insult you, they expect a defensive retort. When you offer only a slight, amused smile, you completely shatter their script. By starving your opponents of emotional data, you force them to project their own fears and insecurities onto your blank canvas. People are terrified of mirrors because they are forced to look at their own reflections. You become unreadable, and unpredictability is the genesis of fear. But starving them of your emotions is only the defensive maneuver. The offense requires you to anticipate the knife long before it is drawn. To anticipate that knife, you must fundamentally reprogram how you view human loyalty. Picture a man entering a lucrative business venture with his oldest friend. They bleed for the company together, share the immense stress of the early days, and shake hands on a 50-50 split built entirely on trust. But 3 years later, when a massive buyout is placed on the table, human nature takes the wheel. The friend quietly consults lawyers, maneuvers to dilute the man's equity, and locks him out of the primary accounts. The naive man is completely destroyed. He does not fight back effectively because he is paralyzed by the shock of the betrayal. He spends his energy crying, "How could you?" and sending emotionally unhinged emails that only serve to make his former friend look like the rational party in court. He loses his company, his wealth, and his faith in humanity, all because he believed that a shared history was a guarantee of future loyalty. The ancient Stoics utilized a psychological tool known as premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. They would actively visualize poverty, sickness, exile, and death, so that when tragedy inevitably struck, their minds were already inoculated against the panic. But in the modern arenas of power, visualizing bad luck is not enough. You must visualize active, deliberate treachery. The synthesis of our two philosophies demands that you assume your business partner will eventually try to steal from you. You must assume your closest ally will harbor secret envy when your status eclipses theirs. You must assume that the people who praise you today will gladly step on your neck tomorrow if the incentives align. To the uninitiated, this sounds like a miserable, paranoid way to exist. It sounds like a recipe for a cold and isolated life. It is actually the exact opposite. It is the only way to interact with human beings safely. If you expect absolute, unconditional loyalty as the default setting of human nature, you are operating on a child's understanding of the world. Human beings are biological creatures, driven fundamentally by self-interest, status, and survival. When the pressure is high enough or the reward is large enough, loyalty becomes a luxury most people will readily discard. If you demand perfect loyalty, you will eventually become a bitter, resentful man who hates the world because it failed to meet your impossible, romanticized standards. But if you expect self-interest, you are never disappointed. You are only ever prepared. This is where the Machiavellian component executes. When you build the partnership, you do not just rely on a handshake and good intentions. You structure the legal contract so that betrayal is mathematically ruinous to the other party. You deliberately hold back a critical piece of leverage, a vital network connection, a proprietary skill or exclusive access to capital that ensures they will always need you slightly more than you need them. You can enjoy their company, you can share the success, and you can be a phenomenal partner, but you never hand them the keys to your destruction. So, when the betrayal inevitably occurs, you do not gasp. You do not suffer a nervous breakdown or beg for an explanation. You simply nod. You say to yourself, "I saw this coming at mile marker 6. Because you stripped the emotion from the event years in advance, you handle their treachery with the clinical detachment of a surgeon removing a tumor. There is no drama, no screaming match, and no plea for cosmic justice. There is only a precise, surgical counterstrike using the leverage you prepared 3 years ago, leaving them outmaneuvered while you walk away entirely intact. When you assume everyone is capable of betrayal, you no longer fear the fire. You simply learn how to forge your reputation within it. To forge that reputation within the fire, you must abandon one of the most toxic pieces of advice ever peddled by modern self-help. You have been told time and time again to ignore what other people think of you. Pop Stoicism insists that other people's opinions are outside of your control, and therefore they should mean nothing to you. In the abstract, this sounds incredibly liberating. In the real world, it is professional and social suicide. In any human hierarchy, what people think of you is absolutely your business. It dictates your access to resources, your mating prospects, your ability to form strategic alliances, and your ultimate safety. If you ignore the theater of reputation, you do not become a sage. You simply become a convenient target. Consider the earnest, hard-working man who takes this advice literally in a highly competitive corporate environment. He puts his head down, executes his tasks flawlessly, and completely ignores office politics. He believes his pristine merit will speak for itself. He refuses to self-promote because he thinks playing optics is shallow. What is his reward? He becomes entirely invisible. When a high-stakes project inevitably fails and the executives come looking for blood, a charismatic, manipulative rival, the man who spends his days actively managing perceptions and curating favor, needs a scapegoat. The invisible man, having cultivated no formidable awe and built no protective alliances, is sacrificed without a second thought. He is fired, comforting himself with the pathetic delusion that he maintained his integrity, while the rival receives a bonus. The pure Stoic ignores reputation and gets slaughtered. But the pure Machiavellian falls into an equally fatal trap. He becomes entirely obsessed with his public image. He needs the applause. He becomes addicted to validation, and that addiction makes him a slave to the crowd. Anyone who can flatter a narcissist secretly owns him, and anyone who can publicly insult him controls his reactions. The synthesis requires a profound psychological split. You must treat your reputation exactly how a wealthy man treats a piece of commercial real estate. It is an external asset. You curate it meticulously. You project competence, reliability, and just enough underlying danger to ensure that no one dares to test your boundaries. You learn to speak the language of the crowd, you smile at the right moments, and you play the optics game flawlessly. You might even orchestrate that toxic rival's quiet downfall, leaving a trap they blindly walk into, while your own hands remain completely clean in the public eye. You manipulate the theater of perception with absolute Machiavellian precision. But behind the mask, there is only silence. You do not actually believe your own press release. This is where your Stoic discipline anchors you. You detach your ego entirely from the avatar you have created. When the boardroom or your social circle praises you, you do not let the validation warm your heart, because you know they are simply applauding a phantom you designed for them. And when they slander you, you do not feel the sting of rejection, because they are merely attacking an illusion. Most men shatter under public pressure because their mask is glued directly to their face. An attack on their reputation is felt as a literal attack on their soul. By separating your self-worth from your public persona, you become completely unshakable. You care about the strategic utility of your reputation, but you're entirely immune to its emotional weight. You master the crowd by stepping entirely out of it, but this kind of elevation comes with a psychological cost most men are too fragile to pay. The price of this elevation is a profound and incurable loneliness. When you finally open your eyes to the mechanical, self-interested nature of human behavior, you can never close them again. You will walk into a crowded room, a networking event, or a family dinner, and you will no longer see a party. You will see an ecosystem of predators and prey. You will observe the subtle, calculated posturing for status. You will catch the micro-expressions of envy flashing across a friend's face when you announce a victory. You will listen to people complain about the tragedies in their lives, and you will clearly see how they actively engineered their own destruction just to harvest pity from the crowd. You will see the puppet strings attached to everyone around you, and it will feel like you are the only adult forced to sit indefinitely at the children's table. The greatest danger in adopting this dual operating system is not that you will become evil, but that you will succumb to nihilism. When you strip away the romantic illusions of society and see that so much of human interaction is merely a disguised transaction, the world can lose its color. You might ask yourself, if everything is just power dynamics, leverage, and biological imperatives, what is the point of playing at all? Why not just isolate yourself completely? This is precisely where Stoicism must step in to save you from the abyss of your own Machiavellianism. Machiavelli teaches you the lethal mechanics of how to play the game, but Stoicism provides the noble foundation of why you must play it. You do not study the dark psychology of control to become a tyrant. You study it to become unkillable. The world is heavily populated by actual monsters, men and women who use manipulation, deceit, and ruinous tactics with absolutely zero conscience. They are constantly scanning the perimeter for weakness. If you cling to the delusion of passive virtue, if you refuse to grow claws simply because you want to view yourself as a pure soul, You are leaving the gates of your own life wide open. If good men refuse to hold the sword because they are afraid of the blade, the wicked will inherit the earth by default. You cannot protect your family, your legacy, or your own sanity by being harmless. You must cultivate the capacity for absolute destruction, and then exercise the supreme discipline to keep it sheathed until the exact moment it is required. You synthesize the cold strategy of the fox with the unbreakable internal fortress of the sage. You learn how to ruin a manipulator's life not because you take sadistic pleasure in their suffering, but because their removal is a logistical necessity for your peace. You become the monster so that you can slaughter the monsters. This is the ultimate transformation. You no longer oscillate between the pathetic extremes of the exploited victim and the guilty aggressor. You become the sovereign player, a man who is completely fluid in his capacity for violence and entirely rigid in his capacity for peace. Tomorrow you do not complain about the game. You observe, you adapt, and you rule. But understand this. What I have shared here is merely the public-facing architecture. There are depths to this operating system, strategies of shadow integration, covert leverage, and psychological warfare that simply cannot be broadcast to the masses without triggering the algorithm's sensors. Those uncompromising truths are reserved only for the initiates. If you have the stomach for reality, subscribe. But if you want to master the forbidden laws that govern the top 1%, look for the join button and step behind the velvet curtain. We are waiting for you.